Well, you know, the law may be an ass, but this morning we have invaluable advice on how to avoid lawyers and expensive legal proceedings and a whole range of issues. We're joined by a lawyer himself, Paul Brennan. Paul, good morning to you.
Hi, Kerry.
Well, yes, we all know the law can be ass, and it's not always right, it's not always true, but we want to cover some area this morning. Neighbourhood disputes, fighting with parents, do-it-yourself wills, buying a house, even getting arrested. You've written a very clever book about it. Okay, let's start with parents who are fighting, especially if there's children involved. What's your advice?
My advice is that when people are approaching a time at the end of their marriage or their partnership, they tend to approach it by slamming doors and shouting at each other. But I think that, and that's very understandable, but quite honestly, my advice is that's not the time to do it. If you really can't stop shouting at your partner or your husband or your wife, then maybe you're not ready for divorce. Maybe you really have to go back, be married for a couple more years and get that out of your system, because my experience is that the more satisfying the insult, the more it costs you in legal costs to get out of it.
Yeah, but if you're at your wit's end and you can't cope in the marriage any longer, or the relationship, especially if there's children.
Well, I think that especially if there's children, really, you know, although this person, obviously your partner you're leaving is a real rat bag, you do have to keep up a semblance of a relationship with them for the children. Mm-hmm. And if you can't just stay stum at that particular time and not make comments which are insulting, then you will find that it'll be expensive legally. If you've got the money, that's fine. I'm sure any lawyer will be happy to do it for you.
So insults can lead to expense.
They can, and any lawyer will fight it to your last penny if that's what you decided to do. Mm-hmm. But you don't necessarily, it doesn't have to be like that.
Okay, neighbourhood disputes. Now, this has got to be one of the top 5 that the courts have to deal with and lawyers have to deal with.
It's very, very common, and I think that what tends to happen is that people have some sort of confrontation with their neighbour, and that's really to be avoided. You know, if you can cope with just an occasional sneaky act, which they might not find out about it, that's better. But the confrontation, if the credits rolled after you're walking away feeling very satisfied with what you've said, that'd be great. But unfortunately they don't, and you have to be there day after day after day. And confrontations like that can turn into husbands get involved. There might be pushing and shoving, and when you get pushing and shoving, often the police are called, and the evidence that the police go on is what your neighbour says about you. And a push can then turn into a punch.
So control your temper.
I think you've got to control your temper, and if you can't control your temper, then I think that what you've got to do is you've got to take your spouse out to dinner perhaps and pick on waiters or motorists on the way, people of lesser stature, but don't pick on anybody who knows where you live, because it's going to end up you're moving. That's going to be the...
At the end of the day, unless you move, that's the only way you're going to resolve it. Is there no other way besides getting lawyers involved?
Well, there's mediation. I think the best way to do it is not to start in the first place. Let's face it, we all know neighbours can be irritating, but try not to have that first confrontation.
Okay, buying a house and keeping the first one, if you're sort of adding to the budget, adding to your portfolio.
What tends to happen is that sometimes people just can't wait. They have to have that house, and they haven't sold their own house, and therefore they go to the bank and get bridging finance, and what happens is that the first house does not sell, and then they're left with 2 houses and interest going up and up. The same thing is where people go ahead and buy a house without having arranged the finance or thinking that they've had a verbal okay from the bank. It can lead to real problems, and it's something to be avoided. You should wait and make sure you've got the finance in place.
We hear a lot these days about do-it-yourself wills.
Do-it-yourself was, I think a lot of people can't even find their own car keys, and if you were challenging someone's will, you've got a relative, or you've done lots for them, but they die and they don't leave you anything, then what would you prefer? Would you prefer to challenge a do-it-yourself will, or would you prefer to have one which was prepared by a lawyer? You'd really jump up in the air and punch the air, because you've got a do-it-yourself will. They'll be probably easier to challenge. Courts will be more suspicious about them.
And unfortunately, but very occasionally, this does happen. Someone in the family gets arrested. Now, if you actually get arrested, who knows what to do?
Well, I think that, and it's very hard, especially if it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you're drunk, to work out what the right thing is to do. Normally it would be perhaps you're being arrested, or more likely your 16-year-old son. And all of a sudden within the family, look, we all support the police, we don't like burglars, we don't like criminals, but if you're arrested or your son's arrested, you will see it in a completely different way. And what you have to do is, if you're arrested, is don't say anything and call a lawyer. I've represented numerous people who've been in that situation, and some kind of feel they don't want to embarrass the police officer, and therefore they don't necessarily call the lawyer. So other people think they can talk themselves out of it, but they are in a situation where the policeman's certainly sure that they've done something, so they should really leave it to a court at that stage.
So in terms of the Dummy's Guide to Lawyering, your advice is?
Dummy's Guide to Lawyering, I think that, well, look, the law might be an ass, and you may feel that way, but it can really bite you on the backside. So there are certain times when you should go and see a lawyer. If you're in a legal hole, stop digging. It's that sort of thing.
Very good advice. Paul, good to talk to you, and thank you.
Thank you, Kerry Ann.